I don't know if you follow Apple very closely, but if you're watching this video, you should know that I absolutely do. This was the year I got serious about making videos, but when I started, I didn't own a computer that was powerful enough to do any sort of meaningful video production. After doing some research, it turns out that my only options were to either spend $3,000 on a MacBook Pro, plus another $300 on the video editing software, or $800 on an iPad Pro, plus an extra $30 for the video editing software. That is pretty much just as fast as the MacBook. Guess which one I got? And I love this thing. Throw in a keyboard and an Apple Pencil and boom, full video production setup. And it works great. You can even tell that these videos were all made on an iPad. And it seems like Apple is pretty thrilled by the iPad too, because in their big developer conference this year, they announced that the Mac is going from looking like this to like this. By the way, here's how iPads look. And on top of that, new Macs are going to be able to start running iPad and iPhone apps natively. And Apple will start pushing harder for developers to only make their apps available from the Mac App Store, since the iOS App Store was so successful.
How cool is that?
Look, I can understand why Apple would think this is the right move for the Mac, and a lot of people definitely thought that this was inevitable regardless. The iPad is pretty quickly rising in popularity, the iPhone basically single-handedly made Apple the biggest company in the world, and in general, touch-based devices way outsell traditional computers at this point. And developers are investing more and more into making cool apps and utilities specifically for them. But this feels a lot like if a pizza restaurant looked at the popularity of chocolate and said, hey, chocolate is really popular, so let's put it in everything. But if you suddenly had a pizza with chocolate on it, you'd be pretty upset and confused. You were expecting a pizza, not dessert. And in that same way, when you buy and use a Mac, you're expecting to use a Mac, not an iPad. What I mean by that is that the Mac only really has two distinguishing features compared to the iPad: a keyboard and mouse-based interface, and freedom. And that's specifically why you would buy a Mac and not an iPad. Let's start with the interface. Even though you can have a keyboard and mouse connected to your iPad, and it works fine, apps are mostly designed with the assumption that you'll be using your finger to navigate. But fingers aren't really good for pointing and tapping at precise things. People have various sizes of fingers, and your finger often visually blocks the thing that you're trying to touch on the screen. Plus, your finger doesn't ever really hold still. Try holding your finger steady in front of you without moving it at all, and you'll find that it's really hard to do. So apps made for touchscreens need to have a lot of space between buttons and touchable elements, and a lot of margin for user error. But that's not really the case with a mouse. You can have very precise pointing and clicking with a mouse because it literally points to the exact pixels you're going to be clicking on. The pointer doesn't change sizes, it doesn't move when you're trying to keep it still, and it's small enough that it usually doesn't block the thing you're trying to click. It also makes it possible to use multiple screens with the same computer. Long story short, using a mouse doesn't have any of the limitations that using your fat human fingers has. What this means is that you can use space way more efficiently with traditional computers, and when you're a professional using a Mac, every pixel counts. This is especially true because the Mac, and most apps for pros for that matter, is designed around having multiple windows on a single screen, allowing you to perform half a dozen different operations at once. This kind of information and action density is only possible because the pointer is precise enough to let you press really small buttons in small spaces. And this brings me to my second point, which is freedom. What I mean by freedom is that modern Macs are, and always have been, pretty open environments. You can download apps and programs from pretty much anywhere, especially from the internet, and they don't really have to follow any of Apple's rules. It means you can create tools with direct access to the hardware, which allows developers to build extremely powerful and efficient tools that aren't possible on the iPad, which is really important for programmers and anybody who works with any sort of 3D media. Developers and companies can also have whatever business models they think are the most effective, whether it's one-time purchases or having subscriptions, or even letting customers only pay for the features they need. Developers can choose whatever they think works best for them and for their customers. Now, this freedom does have downsides, specifically malware downsides. Pretty much any app can use that same unrestricted access to do literally anything it wants to your computer, and the fact that payments go online basically means you don't have a guarantee that your credit card information won't get stolen. To be absolutely fair, these downsides primarily apply to older people who didn't grow up with the internet, and extremely young children who haven't had a chance to grow up with the internet, neither of whom understand basic internet safety principles. But this level of freedom just isn't available on the iPad. All apps have to come from the App Store and go through Apple's review process, so nothing can stray too far out of what Apple wants users to do on the iPad. And all payments must use Apple's in-app payment system, where Apple takes between a 15 and 30% cut. And just to be clear, I think from a security perspective, this decision is mostly justified. Smartphones and iPads always know your location and have an enormous amount of sensitive personal data, from contacts and pictures to email accounts and calendars, to an extent that traditional computers never had. Even with the current restrictions, companies are doing everything they can to get whatever data they can possibly get their hands on. But with Macs, you don't really need the same level of built-in security, and if anything, the lack of it makes it more appealing to professionals who typically know how to keep themselves safe anyway. But those are really the only two things that differentiate the Mac and the iPad: what the interface is optimized for, and how much freedom you have on it. There are no other major differences, especially now that you can buy an iPad with a keyboard and mouse. I mean, really, unless you're a professional, I would argue that it doesn't make sense to buy a Mac anymore. Think about it. At least 90% of the people who use a Mac today don't use a single app that isn't completely platform agnostic, aside from Messages, which is also available on the iPad. Just about everything you use a Mac for is basically just on the internet. Google Drive or the Microsoft apps, Slack, Facebook, YouTube, Netflix, Hulu, all of these apps can be accessed from any device with a browser. And in all of these cases, you don't need the precision of a mouse to do any of them, as evidenced by the fact that all of these apps are available on smartphones. But if you're a professional, you absolutely need the precision and freedom that a Mac currently gives you. That is non-negotiable. I'm a professional software developer, and I literally couldn't do 60% of my job if I had to use an iPad. And trust me, I've definitely tried. I use tools like PyCharm and Postman, which are super resource intensive and have a crazy high information density, and a terminal with direct file access, which is literally illegal to have on the iPad. Or the Mac App Store, actually. And I'm sure a lot of other professionals who use the Mac will say the same thing. The tools they need require the precision and access to hardware that only a Mac can provide. So Apple's design decisions to specifically restrict access in the Mac and make the interface more touch-friendly in their big update this year are not only concerning for me personally, but they also make very little business sense. For starters, as more people get used to the idea of using an iPad as their personal computer, I think people will just stop buying traditional laptops altogether unless they specifically want to code or something. Again, you can buy an iPad and a mouse and keyboard for hundreds of dollars less than the cheapest Mac currently available, and you can do all of the same things you would do on a Mac, even without a keyboard and mouse on an iPad. But you know who won't stop buying Macs? Big tech companies and professionals, who even now are probably the biggest purchasers of Macs. As far as I can tell, every major tech company today buys all of their employees MacBooks, because as a software engineer, you need the power and freedom that it gives you, and you also need Unix, so Windows isn't a great option. Those jobs are always going to need traditional computers, and they're definitely going to be the primary customers of the Mac as time goes on. So designing Macs for casual customers doesn't make a lot of sense. If you just need a computer and you like touchscreens, you'll get an iPad, not a Mac with a touchscreen. If you still prefer a computer with a keyboard and mouse, you can buy an iPad with a keyboard and mouse for half the cost of a Mac. It just makes more financial sense. And you know what? That was probably done on purpose. Apple made an ad saying the same things I'm saying now. They're pushing for most consumers to replace laptops with iPads. And honestly, I agree with Apple here, because personally, I way prefer using an iPad over a Mac for most things. But again, professionals who use the Mac don't have a good alternative to it. So removing or weakening the critical features for the Mac's primary customers is at best a short-term waste of Apple's time and money if they realize their mistake, and at worst forces people to stop using Macs entirely if Apple takes it too far. Please, Apple, as someone who uses the Mac a ton every day for work, and who has seen firsthand how really huge companies depend on the Mac being distinctly not an iPad, please stop making the Mac like an iPad. Nobody wins from this, least of all you.